elements of design, which is line, shape, color, space, form, value, and texture. A lot of these things that we're going to talk about are ways you are able to create a work of art. These are basically like your tools that you'd find in your toolbox to create a two-dimensional image. One of the first ones that we're going to go over that is extremely important is line. Line is an identifiable path created by a point moving in space. It is one-dimensional. It can vary in width, direction, and length. Lines often define the edges of a form. Lines can be horizontal, vertical, or diagonal, straight or curved, thick or thin. Lines are really important when it comes to the creation of art because it can create different images, it constructed in various different ways. Many artists use line in a variety of different methods. We'll take a look at Paul Klee here. Paul Klee is using very thin lines that have contour to them, meaning that these will create a very specific shape. Whereas someone like Carl Krull uses lines in a really dense manner, so it creates almost like a texture or like a topography. So you can get a sense of how different artists use lines. These are artists from art history that we're citing here. And, you know, if you look at other artists like Keith Haring, where he uses really thick, bold lines, he also uses color, which we'll get into a little bit later. And that's a way he can really use and punctuate an image. The next thing we're going to talk about is shape. Shape is when a line becomes an enclosure of a space, where a line forms a boundary and the space is within the shape. So you could start off with something like a line like Paul Klee did, you know, and once those lines are closed, you know, this actually makes a shape similar to what we're seeing in the image over here. Shapes can be broken down into several different categories. So we have three right here. We have geometric, which are things like squares, circles, and triangles. Organics, which are things that you'd see in kind of like nature, or you'd see, you know, a little bit more abstracted or amorphous. And then, you know, abstract, where, you know, these are more kind of like graphic images, but then, you know, the word abstract also can mean non-representational as well. So good person to look at as far as shape. So, you know, in this lecture, we're going to be doing a mixture of artists that you would find in an art history class, as well as some contemporary artists that you'd find exhibiting today. This is Vasily Kandinsky, and he is someone that you would see in your art history books. He's very famous for using bright color, and he's really well known for different shapes. And Kandinsky's work can be seen quite a bit at the Guggenheim Museum, not too far away in New York City. The next thing we're going to cover is color. And color is really important because color is something that you can use to express certain things in an image. You know, color can really dictate the mood or the aesthetic of things. And what it is, it's an element of art made up of three different properties, which is hue, value, and intensity. Intensity, the quality of brightness and purity, with in parentheses, high intensity equals color, strong and bright. Low intensity is color that is faint and dull. So, you know, color can be broken down into several different ways, and it's used really in very many interesting ways by several artists. So if we want to take a look at an example from somebody that does something that would be strong and bright, again, another one in your art history books, this is Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol is an artist that is well known for silkscreen, and he is what's considered a pop artist. So somebody that's using like mass-produced imageries or the imagery from pop culture and making something that's like pretty accessible to the public. So Andy Warhol, strong and bright. You'll often see him at places like MoMA. He may have some stuff at the Guggenheim. He also has a museum that's dedicated to all his artwork in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So if you really are enjoying what you're seeing here or want to know more about his work, that is a great place to go and find out a little bit more information. If we want to look at something that is using faint and dull, so now we're going to take a look at a contemporary artist. His name is Trenton Doyle Hancock, and he does a lot of work about self-portraiture and these really kind of messed up psychological images. So this is a person running on a treadmill and having another figure in the far away in the distance, kind of looking at the figure running on the treadmill, kind of judgingly. So this is a faint and dull color palette. But then if you really look at the image, you see how there's certain areas of color that are popping out, right? Particularly the word fat on the top part of the treadmill, really emphasizing kind of like that shaming thing going on in this image. Trenton Doyle Hancock's a really interesting artist, and we'll be watching Art 21 on him further in the semester. Another one using color in a really interesting way, and this is more of like a palette that's using several different colors. We focused on strong and bright and faint and dull, and now we're looking at Wangari Mutu and her palette is a lot more mixed. So you have some areas that are kind of like skin and flesh colored, but then you have areas that are where the flowers are coming out, where your eyes kind of moving around the image quite a bit. So there's a lot going on here, and that's because of the way she used the color. The pinks are kind of creating different focal points, which are points of emphasis when you look at an image. All around the figure. So your eyes constantly moving around it to see what's going on in this image. Another type of color we're going to talk about is monochromatic color. So monochromatic color means using one color. So the word mono always means one. So if you take other classes, say that you take printmaking and you go over monoprints, that means making a single print. So it's one of a kind. So monochromatic color, in this case, Pablo Picasso's only using blues in here. So we have lots of examples of different monochromatic images that you could find throughout art history. But this one I thought was the best one to kind of emphasize what we were talking about as far as monochromatic color was concerned. And if we analyze this a little bit further, color, I mentioned before, has a lot to do with mood or aesthetic, right? So because of the color use of the blue and just the way the figure is represented here, the image seems like very somber or very kind of like haunting, and that's because of the colors that Picasso chose in order to make this image. Then we have another method of color which is called selective colors. So basically it's similar to kind of how Wangari Mutu used the pinks and used the flower elements to kind of emphasize different points of the body. Well, I think Amy Sherald really has selective color down as far as technique to show what's going on in a painting, to really emphasize what's important in an image. So in this case, Amy Sherald, a lot of her work has to do with how she feels that the African American community is kind of overlooked in a lot of different ways. So that's why she chooses to paint the skin colors, usually like kind of like a muted or a gray color, kind of like how Trenton Doyle Hancock's using the faint and dull technique. So she's using the faint and dull technique on the skin, but then all of the clothing and the backgrounds are all, in the bright, strong and bright color schemes, right? So she's using color in a selective way to really emphasize the figures and how important they are. So she has a really kind of interesting relationship going on here between her color use of a faint and dull palette and a strong and bright palette. Okay, so form. The next thing, the next element is a one that pertains to the way a shape or physical configuration occupies space. So basically, like how we use um, a shape, but in this case, it's kind of represented like a little bit more three dimensionally because shape, they were kind of like more graphic and flat, whereas these that we're looking at right here, the forms, these are representative of objects. If you take a drawing class, you typically like draw these in a still life. And, this is showing like more of like a three-dimensional or tangible form. Next thing we're going to talk about is texture. Now, this image is really famous. This is Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night. And this work is really famous for its textural qualities. In fact, if you go to the Met, where this, I'm sorry, the MoMA, where this painting is, if you are able to get up to a reasonable distance, you can see the thickness of the strokes of, the sky and the different strokes he used to create the town below and then the cypress tree in the foreground. It's really, thick when you see it. In fact, there's a theory that the paint's so thick that it's still wet in some layers underneath after all these years of it being in existence. So Van Gogh's a really good one for texture use as far as, creating something that has a lot of visual, like topography. If we go back, we're going to go way back, throwback to Carl Kroll, similar technique, except Kroll's using it with line. But this is also kind of creating a textural quality because he's using the line in such a way where it's dense and it has a look of texture, similar to how Vincent van Gogh is doing it here. Okay, so now that we covered design elements, now design elements, just as a review, that's your tools in your toolbox for creating an artwork that is representing different things, right? So, if you're using things like texture, you're using things like form or selective color, those are all elements, those are all tools to create a work of art. Now we're going to talk about design principles, which are ideas or just different design theories on how to create artwork. So we're going to look at several different examples here. Some of these are three-dimensional, so you'll see how they go about it, but it can easily be applied to two-dimensional art. So we have the first one, which is probably one of the most common things you'll see in a lot of artwork, is the idea of variety. And that is a way of combining visual elements to achieve and integrate complex relationships. Variety can be expressed in hues, values, lines, textures, and shapes. So just to review, right here, these are your elements, your tools in your toolbox. They're being represented on the image up here in order to create variety. So if we look at this image, there's one kind of like repeated shape of a building, right? So, you have a white building, it has like at least one window, and, sometimes there's two, sometimes there's three, sometimes there's plants, sometimes there's different things. But relatively, it's the same shape, just kind of altered in different ways. Okay, so when you have a figure, maybe you want to duplicate that figure and have it in a different position, or have it, one shorter, one larger. So variety can be achieved by, moving things around on the page, moving images around, several different ways. Variety can also be achieved with different shapes, but then all united by one thing. So in this image, these are all like this white building that's kind of being repeated in various different manners, whereas the Eva Hesse image that we're looking at down here, This is all unified by different color, and these are all kind of different shapes. So they're being varied in different ways. You're seeing some longer shapes, you're seeing more, circular shapes, and, they all kind of relate to one another, but they're all different at the same time. Andy Goldsworthy, this is a photographer, so he's using bark in order to fill up this tree trunk. So just a little background on his work is he takes a lot of elements from nature and he integrates them into and he creates these like little installations in nature that are temporary. He doesn't really use any tools or anything aggressive. He just takes what he finds basically in the woods or just different landscapes and then creates artwork in response to that. Rhythm. So rhythm is more or less a regular pattern created by the elements of design as they seem to move and change through time and space. So rhythm, think of music when you have like, a beat or, something's like a repeated pattern, right? So rhythm is like a repeated pattern. If we look at these sculptures here, every sculpture is kind of on a similar level, similar color. They're all kind of consistent here. Rhythm can also be something that doesn't necessarily have to be uniform. A rhythm can be something that is showing like one specific movement. Rhythm can also show a unified pattern, but then have varying, we're bringing in another design element here, varying figures. So in this case, we have these figures with different gestures. Emphasis. So emphasis can also be interchanged with the term focal point. We find this a lot in art. Emphasis is the part of design that catches the viewer's attention. The artist will make one area stand out by contrasting it with other areas. The area could be different in size, color, texture, shape, etc. So in this case, I would argue there's several points of emphasis. So I've had students look at this image and I've had several different answers, which were all valid and correct. So most people say the point of emphasis is on the ground here, where the spire is kind of drilling itself into the foreground here. And because like the sculpture is so large and visually it's making a direction that's going straight down. So people will say, oh, that's where the emphasis is. But then other people have said, oh, this window up here where the light is peering through, that's where my eye is drawn first. And, I think both answers are definitely valid. Both of them kind of draw points of emphasis. So whenever you are creating something with emphasis, you have to really think about your viewer and you have to think about where are they going to look first? What's going to draw their eye in first? If we look at this sculpture here, where would the point of emphasis be? Most students would say, and I agree, and I don't typically find any other focal point or points of emphasis in this image, but I would say that negative space, which is right here, that void that's being created by the sculpture itself. So that's where the focal point would be in this image. This one, I would say the focal point is moving up toward the sky, similar to the first image where we had the tower part, the tower top going down. In this case, the tower is going up top. Most people, if you look at most religious structures, a lot of them are built in kind of like a tower format. And the theory was to be, closer to a higher power to an extent. So usually that's why you see a lot of structures like that are built that way. So in this case, we're seeing the point of emphasis moving upward. Next thing we want to talk about is balance. It is the distribution of visual weight of objects, colors, textures, and space. If the design were to scale, the elements would be balanced to make a design feel stable. So we have several different types of balance to consider here. So here is the formal placement of each side of imagery of vertical axis. So this is symmetrical balance we're talking about. So basically you could take a form and you could cut it in half and that would create something that would be considered symmetrical. Asymmetrical means areas on either side of a central vertical axis are not identical but appear to have the same visual weight. So in this case, the piece, it's the opposite of symmetrical. You have different elements over here where your visual weight could go to either one side or the other. Radial balance, this is kind of like similar to the concept of a mandala or like a repeated image or something using like a circular image. This is where you use elements that are arranged around a central point and may be similar. Next concept is proportion and scale. So this is a way you can use images to be either more or less important, and you can use scale in a really clever way and create something that's visually interesting. So this artist here, we're looking at another 3D piece. This is Ron Mueck, and this is his large figure, and this is a real person here viewing it. So he wanted to do something that was really large scale and extreme in comparison to this artist that was doing something really small that you have to like really look at and investigate. So you could use scale to your advantage when it comes to creating different types of images. Next is unity. So it's the feeling of harmony between all parts of a work of art, which creates a sense of completeness. So in this case, this piece has lots of little elements to it. There's a lot of components, but as you look at the piece, it has like one concept where it's kind of like this bed altar piece. But when you investigate the smaller parts, there's a lot going on. Like here, you have all of these different elements of like saints and religious figures that are on like the bed, different pictures that are in the sculpture. A lot going on. Unity, again, we have somebody named John Bisbee who does these sculptures that are all kind of like one shape, but then they come together as like one form, like these and like these. So so basically he's using repeated elements in order to create a sculpture, but this can also be done in an image as well. Tara Donovan is using Dixie cups in order to create something that's like repeated and has a similar pattern like John Bisbee here. As far as the principles of design and the elements of design, so just to recap, elements are your toolbox to construct your image. Principles are the ideas behind how you put your image together.